Well, thank you for coming tonight. The format's going to be a little bit different than it was over the past couple of years. We're going to have my presentation, and then after that we'll take the short break to have a cup of coffee, stretch legs, use the restroom or whatever. But since we're focusing on the way of the cross, we'll close each night with the stations, with the help of the Rosary Altar Society, and we'll use a different set of stations each week. I pick out stations that I think go more with the theme of the evening, and because the whole point of it is seeing the way of the cross through different eyes, through the different people that were involved in it. Tonight we'll use the stations that we gave out the other day, and if anyone doesn't have it, there are copies on the radiators back there that you can pick up when we have a coffee break, because we're not going to do them till the second half anyway. The basic theme is that to look upon the cross, there has to be some reaction. There has to be something that's moved. For some, it was fear. For others, it was anger. Others shouted blasphemy, and others shouted, "Hail the King of the Jews." But to see what's going on, to hear what's going on at that moment, somehow we need to have some kind of response. And what I want to talk about is the response from the eyes of the different people that were involved. Tonight I want to talk about the two criminals that were hung on either side of Jesus, because I think they give us that archetypical example of something different is going on in each one of them. But maybe we shouldn't be too quick to judge. Maybe we're kind of harsh on the one and easy on the other, because the reality as we come to see it in life is that it's never quite that black and white. But there's always a lot of gray matter that's involved. We'll be talking about the different people that are just ancillary to what's going on, but who all have something to add to the spirituality of that route. And they all have some part on the journey that has a message for each one of us. Simon of Cyrene, who helps Jesus carry his cross. Joseph of Arimathea, who asks for the body of Jesus once it's taken down. Nicodemus, who, as a Pharisee, goes to Jesus at night, but then again shows up at the cross asking to have the body. He wants to have it laid in a tomb. There's a centurion who, after piercing the side, recognizes Jesus as the Son of God. Another week we're going to talk about one of the main characters, probably one of the characters that is easiest to identify with, and that's Pontius Pilate. Because Pilate gives us that perfect example of confusion, of wanting to take a stance but not being able to, of thinking this might be something going on but not quite understanding it, of realizing that people are asking for very brutal punishment and that this man doesn't deserve it, but also worried about himself and his own position and his own prestige. We'll look at the cross through the eyes of the apostles. Judas, Peter. Where were all the others who were not at the cross? The only one we know is at the cross is John. Where were the others? We'll spend one evening following the way of the cross with Mary. Mary, the only one in the history of our faith who was with Jesus from the cradle to the crib. The only one who was with Jesus knowing who he is from the very beginning until the very end. The very last night is going to be the Wednesday of Holy Week, and that's the soup and scripture supper. Charlie has tickets. I think the Holy Name Society is requesting a $5 donation. He'll have tickets each week. And on that evening, it's going to be the image of the cross in the eyes of Jesus. Why did he do what he did? He prays in the garden, I don't want to do this. Why did he do what he did? And how is this part of his destiny and part of our destiny as a people of faith? But it begins with the basic premise that the cross demands a reaction. Some people might recognize it right offhand. It was March 13th, 1964. I don't know if that date means anything offhand to anybody, but certainly the name will make sense. The name will ring a bell. Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was being brutally murdered in an apartment complex in Brooklyn. After she died, 38 people in their apartments acknowledged having heard her cry for help. And not one of them thought to scream, to go down to help her, or to call the police. And it became one of the biggest embarrassments and scandals in the city of New York. Because here was something that demanded a reaction, but no reaction was given. And because no reaction was given, to follow the logic of it, that in itself was a reaction, because it allowed something to happen. It allowed something to happen without interference because of silence. When I was teaching English, I came across one sentence that uses all the impersonal pronouns, and it really just explains what happened that night. Nobody did what anyone could because everyone thought someone else should. That silence, that not speaking up, that not calling out and saying no, ended up with her death. And all those people felt a guilt. Not because they did the wrong thing, but because they did nothing. They looked upon something that they saw as tragic, and they did nothing. I think one of the most beautiful explanations of what I'm saying comes from the play A Man for All Seasons. Remember the play A Man for All Seasons? Thomas More has been asked to agree to bless the marriage of Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn. He removed his first wife because he was tired of her and she couldn't bear him a boy. And he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, but he could not get the annulment. The Pope would not grant the annulment. And Thomas More refused to bless it, and that is how the Anglican Church got its first start. He said, well, I'm the supreme ruler of England. I will be the supreme over the church. It's now an Anglican church. We are separate from Rome, holding almost all the same tenets as Catholicism, as Roman Catholicism, but their own leadership. Certainly a good reflection with tomorrow being the feast of the solemnity of the chair of St. Peter. But Henry VIII wanted Thomas More to approve the marriage, and he would not. He said nothing. And he was arrested for it, and he was being questioned by Thomas Cromwell. And Cromwell, in the middle of the court proceedings, says, "But gentlemen of the jury, there are many kinds of silence. Consider first the silence of a man when he is dead. Let us suppose we go into the room where he is laid out and we listen. What do we hear? Silence. What does it betoken, this silence? Nothing. This is silence, pure and simple. But let us take another case. Suppose I were to take a dagger from my sleeve and make to kill the prisoner with it, and my lordships there, instead of crying out for me to stop, maintain their silence. That would be token. It would be token a willingness that I should do it. And under the law, they would be guilty with me. So silence can, according to the circumstances, speak. Let us consider now the circumstances of the prisoner's silence. The oath was put to loyal subjects up and down the country, and they all declared His Grace's title to be just and good. But when it came to the prisoner, he refused. He calls this silence. Yet, is there a man in this court, is there a man in this country who does not know Sir Thomas More's opinion of this title? And how can this be? Because this silence betoken, nay, this silence was not silence at all, but most eloquent denial. And Thomas More says, not so, Master Secretary. The maxim is qui tace consentire. The maxim of the law is silence gives consent. If you wish to construe what my silence betokened, you must construe that I consented, not that I denied. Cromwell says, is that in fact what the world construes from it? Do you pretend that is what you wish the world to construe from it? And Moore simply answers, the world must construe according to its wits. This court must construe according to the law. So according to the law, the people who were silent at the cross did nothing wrong. But did they? When we look at the cross demands something from us. That whole image of kissing the cross on Good Friday, showing our respect for the sacrifice that was laid upon that cross, should arouse some type of feeling, some type of emotion within us. If we're really going to come to appreciate that, we need to remember what crucifixion was and what was different about the crucifixion of Jesus. The cross was not as pretty as the ones we see in churches or the ones we have hanging on our walls. The cross would have been a tree with the bark, with the bugs, with branches that would be sticking out. Be assured that those who were crucifying were not concerned about the comfort of the one about to be crucified. So we had just this empty tree stump. Now what it would have been is either a tree stump that would have been cut out a little bit, a little semicircle in it, because the one to be crucified, we see someone carrying a cross like that. That's not how it would have happened. What it would have been a stump of a tree across both shoulders, and the arms would have been up around it and tied, so that when the person to be crucified arrived at the place of crucifixion, they simply would have taken the sides, hoisted it up, and then just dropped that into a crossbeam, kind of like Lincoln logs. So you would have had this tree that would have had a gully cut into it, that would have had a little valley cut into it, and then the part of the cross that was being carried would have just been placed into that spot. Or a tree that would have had a little piece cut out of it if the tree was that big, and then this piece would have just slipped into it. That's probably the type of cross that Christ was crucified on, because there had to be a little piece that went above him. So if you picture taking a tree, just cut out a little opening, a little oval, and then what Christ would have been carrying would have just been slipped into that, either by people just lifting or by a pulley, if that was necessary. The cross would not have been 15, 20 feet up in the air. The cross would have been very low. You have to remember, the centurion was able to go and pierce the side of Jesus. So if he were up like that, it would not have done it. So he had to be where the point where someone could have walked over and touched his foot. Now, the feet would probably have been straddling the cross and then been tied. The legs were always bent. The legs had to be bent. Crucifixion is death by suffocation, because what happens is, while you have your knees bent and your arms raised, with the passing of time, the only way you're going to breathe is to stand up, is to raise yourself so you can get the air you need in your lungs. Notice in the crucifixion account, we hear that when it started to get late, because they wanted the bodies down before sundown, they were going to respect the Jewish procedures. When they wanted the bodies down before sundown, they broke the legs. They broke the legs because this way now, you can't raise yourself up. And the lungs are going to be emptied of air all the more quickly. So the suffocation will take place a little bit more rapidly. They don't break the legs of Jesus because they see that he's already dead. But it also fulfills the scripture of the prophet Jeremiah that not a bone of his body would be broken. The crucifixion, normally the person would probably have been paraded through the street carrying the cross naked as one last sign of a humiliation, one last sign of a degradation. That would not have happened to Jesus, because the Jewish sensibility on public nudity was much stricter than the Roman sensibility. And the Romans did not want to have a problem with the Jews. The Romans did not want to have any kind of problem where they were going to be doing something that they're doing this for the Jews. They're not going to want the Jews now somehow to be offended. So Christ was clothed. We know that he had a garment that was ripped, or that was not ripped, that for which the soldiers cast lots. But under that, he probably had some type of a loincloth, so he would have been covered on the cross. People would have been tied to the cross, not nailed. But when we look at the story of Christ, the crucifixion is much, much more brutal. Someone would not have been tortured the way Jesus was tortured beforehand. We're talking about the passage of a lot of time, from the garden to Pilate, to Herod, to Pilate. We're talking the passage of hours and hours. Now remember, Jesus has just finished celebrating the Passover with his disciples. So this is now we're going through a night. So there's already the physical exhaustion that's starting to come in. Jesus has been beaten. He's already been manhandled by the soldiers. He receives the scourging. Now, any type of whipping scene is brutal. But the type of scourging that Jesus would have undergone, the whip would not have been just a simple whip. The whip would have broken off into maybe 6 or 7 straps. And on the end of them would have been pieces of barbed wire, pieces of anything that would pierce the skin. So we're saying Jesus received 39 lashes, but 39 lashes with a whip that may have had 5 straps on it, 7 straps on it. So you can now multiply the cuts that are coming and the fact that there would be pieces of flesh that were being pulled. 39 lashes is significant. And it's significant because one of the rules of Rome is that you cannot be unnecessarily cruel. Picture. 40 lashes was not considered unnecessarily cruel. If the person were given 40 lashes as a punishment, you could not give them 41. If one of the soldiers gave a 41st lash, that soldier would receive 40 lashes. Now, did you ever take a belt or something and just snap it? What happens? Sometimes it snaps back. So they would stop at 39, because if the whip snapped back, that would have been the 40th. If they went for the 40th and it snapped back, that would have been 41. So the 39 lashes is not a make-believe number. It's not just a made-up number. It's part of the reality of the brutality with which Jesus was treated. Now, remember, we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, Pilate did that beating on purpose because he was hoping that when he showed Jesus to the crowds, they were going to say, he suffered enough, stop. He didn't know that the crowds were not going to say that. So Jesus, unlike others, had first been scourged. He wore the crown of thorns. Now, the crown of thorns, we see the crown of thorns as you see it on a statue, where it's very neatly braided and makes a nice little shape of a crown. Who's going to do that? They went to a thorn bush, they cut a clump of the thorns, and it was just placed onto his head and dug in so that it would stay on. Now you're talking now about this man who's already suffered, who's already gone through this exhaustion, who's already gone through this pain. And now these thorns that could have been 3-4 inches are just being put into the skin. And all along this, he's being mocked. He's being mocked by the soldiers. These are Roman soldiers. Did they know who he was? Did they have any idea why these things were happening? Are they just following orders? What are they thinking as they're doing this? What are they thinking as they're adding this pain to this man's life? But that's not enough. Because as a further brutality, Jesus is not tied to the cross. Jesus is nailed to the cross. Because it's going to be even more painful, but also because it's going to make the raising himself up to breathe more difficult. Because he doesn't have the ropes holding on that he can hold onto. He's not going to have that strength in his hands. Now, we see pictures, we see very pious pictures, where the nails are in the hands. That couldn't be. It would never sustain his weight. The nails were most probably right here. If you feel your own wrist, you could feel that there's one place where there's a split in the bones, almost right where the pulse is. If a nail were put here, the weight of the body, the weight of the arms, the slumping on the cross, it would have just ripped through. So being put here, the hand would be able to stay up, and then the wrist would put a natural barrier so that it wouldn't slide off. The placement of the feet would have been something a little bit more awkward. Either there were 4 nails, and the nails at the feet would have been right between the ankle and the Achilles tendon, or the feet had to be placed one over the other, and very carefully the nail would have been placed where the feet aren't going to have a bone. Chances are there were 4 nails, and Jesus was legs spread, and the nails went through the sides. There was no little stand. There was no little footrest kind of thing that would have been on that tree. So either his legs were spread so that the tree was between them and the nail went through the side, or the legs had to be crossed over and that nail very carefully placed, because it was going to bear the weight of Jesus trying to stand up. Crucifixion in itself is a brutal death. But the crucifixion of Christ is particularly brutal. He's nailed only after a horrific beating, a beating which in itself could have been fatal, and after the carrying of the cross. Now, to look at that, to see that, there has to be some type of reaction to it. There has to be some way that we say, this is either going to lead to an act of faith and a change of life, or I don't believe it. I don't believe in who Jesus is. Well, on the cross with Jesus are crucified 2 men. Now, St. John's Gospel doesn't mention these 2 men at all. St. John's Gospel, when it talks about the crucifixion, talks only about, and there they crucified him. St. John is more concerned about this being a moment of glory, about Jesus' free acceptance of the cross for the salvation of souls, overshadows completely the reality, the human reality of the cross. So he doesn't even go into all of those details. St. Matthew said, they're talking about the people passing by and saying, oh, he said he was the king of the Jews, and blah, 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 blah. And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. That's it. St. Matthew says, or St. Mark says, those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And that's it. The scene of the 2 thieves that we get comes from St. Luke's Gospel. Now, St. Luke doesn't call them thieves. What St. Luke writes is, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed, justly, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now, St. Luke was not a Jew. St. Luke was a Gentile. a convert of St. Paul. And very much part of what they're doing, of what St. Paul's mission is to evangelize, is to spread the word, to challenge people to make a choice for Christ. So he's the one who comes with this dialogue that probably did take place. There would have been those who would have been there, who would have heard this. You know, people wonder sometimes, well, if Jesus is being crucified and he's up there and he's near death, how can you hear so clearly those 7 last words? Well, because he wasn't that far away. It was by a hill that they call the Skull, by Golgotha, a mountain that had caves in it that looked like 2 eyes and a mouth. It had to be just outside the city, on a road where people would be passing right by it. So if Jesus is calling from the cross, those standing nearby are going to hear what he had to say. Now, no doubt, John heard everything Jesus said. And when he got back with the apostles, he repeated everything Jesus said to them. The gospel writers are going to take what they heard and thought was most important, and those are what they're going to include. The gospel writers do not include all the same last words of Christ. What Matthew and Mark have, Luke and John do not. What Luke has, Matthew, Mark, and John do not. What John has, Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not. And that's how we get the 7 last words, because this is what they heard that made some sense to them. If we had a group of kids getting up one at a time to sing a song or read a poem or something, when we left and you said, okay, what did you like? Chances are most of us would pick something different because it touched us, or because it was our kid, or because it was our neighbor's kid, or for whatever reason, there'll be something different that stays with us. Well, that's how we get the 7 last words of Christ. It's very probable that this discussion actually did take place. But it's too easy to say one is evil, the other is good. How many times has any one of us said, God, why won't you help me? Why aren't you helping me with this? What does that first criminal say to him? If you are the king of the Jews, if this is true, you have the king of the Jews written above your head. If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself and us. How many people have ever said, why does God allow war? Why did God let COVID happen? Of course, there are people who are thinking that this is something that God mystically did. And they're forgetting that these were man-created. God doesn't allow war. Man starts war. God didn't make COVID. COVID was created by man in a laboratory. Man took the intelligence that God gave him to work for good and somehow used it to work for evil. Man did not use the capacity he has to love. Instead, he chose to hate and cause war. But how many of us wonder why God does or does not do things that God does and does not do? What is this man really saying? If this is who you are, I don't know why you're staying on that cross. Think of what a difference it would have made if on the cross, Jesus just said, you know what? Enough of this. Popped out the nails, broke off the ropes, healed his own wounds, jumped off the cross and said, now let's get down to business. Is it unreasonable that this man would wonder, or that this man would question and say, why are you doing this? Why aren't you, save yourself and us? The other one has a very different attitude. The other one has an attitude much more in the lines of a Jewish thinker. Be quiet. We are guilty of our crimes. And he already sees Jesus as innocent, as the innocent lamb of sacrifice. He already sees Jesus as not deserving the punishment that he's getting. And then there's one of the most tender conversations that takes place. Because he believes in who Jesus is, and he believes that somehow God is working at this moment. And rather than say, help me now, he simply says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Somewhere he heard Jesus teach. Somewhere he heard the teachings about the kingdom. He heard the apostles pray the Our Father. Somewhere he had some contact with Jesus, a contact of faith, to be able to know that this was leading to a kingdom. And we can dare to say that he must have had a very genuine contact of Jesus with the faith, because that is the only time in any of the four Gospels that anyone calls Jesus by name. Nowhere else. We don't even hear Mary call him Jesus in speaking to him. It's always Jesus Master, Jesus Lord. But to just call him by name, this is the only time in all the scriptures that anyone feels that affinity. And why? He's sharing in the suffering. He's sharing in the suffering, believing that that suffering somehow will be beneficial. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. He sees that there's something in suffering that's salvific. And in that intimate moment of uniting himself with Jesus in his suffering, he believes that that will be his way to unite himself with Jesus in his glory. And what does Jesus do? But he sees that faith. Don't we hear Jesus, after so many of the miracles, say, your faith has saved you. Your faith has healed you. And he says those simple words, this day you will be with me in paradise. And how much easier it must have been for that man to endure those next hour or minutes, knowing that his faith and the suffering he was accepting was going to lead to the kingdom. United with the suffering, united with that faith that suffering would be his salvation, he enters into an intimate relationship with Jesus and is assured of a place in the kingdom. He is the only one who simply calls Jesus by name, and he is the only one to whom paradise was promised. Jesus never says that to Mary. He never says that to John the Baptist. He never says that to Peter or any of the apostles. He never says that to John the Beloved. The only person to whom Jesus says, "You will be with me in paradise," is this man on the cross. We have one man who sees the suffering of Jesus. He sees the cross. And whether we want to say he mocked it, or we want to say he just didn't understand it, and he wanted a different image of God. He wanted an image of God that was going to take the cross and defeat it, rather than be seemingly defeated by it. And he just says, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself and us." And we have another who understood that part of the experience is suffering, but that suffering can also be salvific if he sees his own suffering as somehow a share in the suffering of Christ on his cross. And by accepting that suffering, we are guilty after all. By accepting that suffering, found his way to the kingdom. Two men saw the same cross. But one was closed to the image, and the other open to the reality of saving suffering. How many times did we hear as children, "I stubbed my toe, offer it up"? But that's not too far from a real theological explanation. Because what does offer it up mean? But align that as just a little share in the suffering of Christ. The two men had different reactions to the cross because they saw two different realities in Jesus. One wanted to see the reality of the type of Messiah they expected. The other seemingly heard Jesus' teachings and understood that there was more than met the eye. One's reaction, we don't know how that ended. What we do know is Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." And I'm sure that that thief who mocked him was part of those who were forgiven. But what we do know is that the person who looked at the cross with faith, who trusted as Jesus did, that suffering would lead to salvation, was promised a place in paradise. We begin by saying simply that looking at the reality of the cross demands some type of response. But we remember too that responding to the reality of the cross also brings with it its consequences. And the consequence of a faithful response to the cross is hearing those words, entering into that intimate relationship with Jesus, and hearing his promise of a place in paradise. Why don't we stop now and take a little break, and then we'll come back for the stations.